Hello, and welcome to the screencast on Augmentative and Alternative Communication, also known as AAC, and Assessment for people with aphasia. As we approach the idea of AAC, Assessment for people with aphasia, we need to think back a bit to the definition of aphasia. The idea that aphasia is a multimodality loss of language and the ability to use symbols. Therefore, we're not simply going to be able to replace the broken symbol system of words with another symbol system of pictures. We're not going to be able to simply put new symbols in place for the person and have them be able to use them. Because in aphasia, the part of the brain that is damaged is the part that is going to assign the meaning to the symbol. So it's not going to matter whether that symbol is a line drawing or whether that symbol is saying a word. Both are going to be problematic in an individual with aphasia. Therefore, we're going to approach AAC and aphasia a little bit differently than we would approach AAC in some of the other populations. We know in this population that the individual is going to have a very difficult time with using symbols. So we're going to have to find ways around symbol use or make the symbols as transparent as possible. Garrett and Lasker have proposed a categorization system for people with aphasia who are going to be AAC users. They start with two broad categories, the first being partner-dependent communicators and the second being independent communicators. Partner-dependent communicators are going to be dependent on a partner in order to reveal their communication competence. In other words, they're going to need someone who has a high level of skill, and this could be a family member or a caregiver such as a nurse or nursing assistant who has been trained in some strategies to help them to communicate the things they want to communicate. Garrett and Lasker further go on to say that there are three types of partner-dependent communicators: emerging communicators, conversational choice communicators, transitional communicators. So those are the three kinds of partner-dependent communicators. There are then individuals who are independent communicators. These are people who are able to use communication strategies on their own to get their message across, but are going to require alternative or augmented strategies to do so. These categories are then, this category is then broken down further into stored message communicators, generative communicators, special need communicators to make up that category. Lastly, we have individuals who have aphasia, but they are non-users. They are not AAC users. So, what are some of the strategies that we might use with individuals in these two broad groups? And we're going to talk about the treatment of people with AAC needs who also have aphasia later on. But for now, a brief overview. Partner-dependent communicators might benefit from augmented input, from basic choice communication, and they usually have little ability to use high-tech AAC devices unless those AAC devices are contextually based or have contextually based scenes as the kind of display that's available to them. Independent communicators then are going to use communication books, gestures, drawing, perhaps vocabulary lists, and might be able to use more high-tech devices with more traditional grids. So, there are three basic categories that need to be, or three basic things that you need to do in an AAC and aphasia assessment. The first is traditional assessment of language and cognition. Why? Because you want to know how much language does this person comprehend, so how how am I going to need to adapt my assessment to them, and what are their partners in the future maybe going to need to do to adapt to their comprehension abilities. What is their expressive ability? So how much of what they want to communicate will they actually be able to communicate through their natural speech? And how is their memory, etc., to help with training decisions? Will they need multiple trials on strategies because there are some memory concerns, or does this person appear to have relatively good memory, good learning, and therefore may not need as prolonged a strategy treatment? We want to do a needs assessment. Why? Because we need to know what the authentic context and the authentic needs of the individual is. Who do they need to talk to? What do they need to talk about? And think beyond basic needs like being able to communicate what they want to eat or what they want to drink or that they need to use the restroom. Instead, think about what do they need to communicate in terms of their finances? What do they need to communicate in terms of their relationships with their family members? What do they need to say to their daughter, their wife, their sister, their aunt? So this is really a very big job to try to come up with what are the needs, what are the communication partners, and what are the needs with those partners. And lastly, then we're going to do an AAC skills assessment. Why? That is to determine what skills does this person bring to the table? What can they do in regards to AAC use and their use of their natural ability? AAC at its core always wants to consider what is the natural ability of the individual, what can they say, what can they gesture on their own, what can they write on their own, and the augmentative and alternative communication part comes in to help to supplement that, not to take it away, but to recognize it, to help to continue to develop it to its maximal level, but to be sure that communication needs are met in the meantime. How is this accomplished? Typically, we accomplish this through a process called AAC trials. That's when we're going to try strategies with people. We're going to try augmented input. We're going to try basic choice strategy. We're going to try a communication board or book. And we're going to see how the person does with it. So, in an AAC skills assessment, which we talked about, the skills that need to be assessed will include unaided modalities. Those are the natural abilities of the person that require no paper, no pen, no electronic device, nothing. This is what they can do on their own. We want to look at partner-supported techniques. What kinds of techniques can the partner do that will help them? We want to look at whether or not they can use externally stored information. That would include a communication board. So communication board has, perhaps if it's grid-based, it's going to have a picture of something with a word underneath it that represents an idea. For example, I'm going to say, go get me my glasses, right? So you're going to have that on a communication board. Can they use that stored information later to actually ask for their glasses? So are they able to use stored messages? Can those stored messages be accessed through a voice output system or through a speech generating device? And then can they generate messages through some kind of voice output system or speech generating device? So for example, can they begin to combine ideas from one page on an AAC device with ideas from another page on an AAC device and combine those together to generate a novel message? So here are some methods to get at the AAC needs and the AAC skills that you're going to be assessing. Remember that the traditional assessment of language and cognition has probably already been completed. So we're really going to focus here on those two other areas of AAC needs and AAC skills assessments. So there is available some categories of communicators checklist that's available from Lasker, Garrett, and Fox, which is a checklist that starts to look at what are some of the characteristics that this person has that would then put them into one of those categories that we started with: the emerging communicator, the transitional communicator, the stored message communicator, etc. So there is a checklist available to help you do that. Some people complete a baseline modality assessment. This is a PACE-like procedure, and PACE is promoting aphasics communication effectiveness. It's a treatment program, but the basic idea is that the person with aphasia has something to communicate that the assessor or the partner does not know, and the two go back and forth as the person tries to communicate the idea, and the assessor is keeping track of what strategies the person is using to try to communicate that. And that would then be a baseline of what they would do before treatment and before augmentative and alternative communication is put in place. And last, a conversational strategy trial. So putting together some materials, maybe a communication board or a communication book, or programming some things on a communication device, and then trying to have a personally relevant conversation with the individual and providing them with those tools, and doing a bit of dynamic assessment where you do some training with them to show them how to use that and see how they're able to then use those strategies. So you're going to model while you're doing this kind of assessment. There are some resources available to you to do these kinds of assessments, and this is actually housed at my university on our website for AAC, and I'm going to try to take us there for a second. So if you go to the link in this PowerPoint and you go to resources and you go down to aphasia assessment, you're going to see that here is a multimodal communication screening task for persons with aphasia, which is a actual kind of test for individuals with aphasia to see how they use various forms of stored messages, and also some of this baseline modality kinds of things. So this is the picture stimulus booklet. Here's the score sheet. There's a visual scanning and attention screening task that's available that'll allow you to look at the person's vision and whether or not they're going to be able to see these kinds of supports. Here's an aphasia needs assessment, so it's kind of a checklist to help you go through the various kinds of needs that the person may have. And then that AAC aphasia categories of communication checklist that I talked about is also available through our website. Okay, I'm going to push this out of the way. So those tools are available to you. They're available to anyone in the world. So I suggest that maybe you take a look at those and keep those in your back pocket as a potential way of doing some assessment in aphasia. So we just kind of went through where to find these materials, but the multimodal communication screening test for people with aphasia is available through that website, and is a method of assessment to help you look at some of these issues and help you explore them with the person with aphasia. If we look at them specifically, oh, it looks like we have a broken link here. So I'm going to go back here and let's try this. Here it is. So here is the actual stimulus booklet. So you can see that this looks at stored messages and the person's ability to use some pictures to communicate some various scenarios. Okay, using maps, do they have any residual spelling or writing ability? That's all considered. So that is a potential resource for you. And then this is your score sheet and your instructions. So here is where you have set up for you what you're going to be doing. So here, look at this book, look at all of the pictures. You could tell me some things by pointing to them. Now look at the rest of the pages. So you can see that this is going to nicely take you through that stimulus book. And then you're going to be keeping track of some of the kinds of things that you have to do to help this person to do the activities for this assessment. So for example, how would you tell me that you need some shoes? And then you're going to kind of keep track of what kinds of cues you were using to help them be able to do those things. So that's more specifically what is on that test, so that you have a little better sense of it, and hopefully when you get to see patients that have aphasia that you think need augmentative and alternative communication, and or you're doing an externship in this area, that you will have some resources available to you, and you'll think back to this free resource, doesn't cost you a thing, available to you. The scanning and the visual piece is also available, as is the categories of communication checklist. We've already reviewed that. So I want to talk to you just very briefly about some research that we have done with San Jose State, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, University of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, and University of Nebraska in Kearney. The project looks at AAC assessment in autism, CP, ALS, and aphasia. My particular part of this research is in the area of aphasia. So we did some review of the literature, a very scoping review of the literature. We analyzed what the literature said should be done in assessment of aphasia. Then we asked experts to do assessments of aphasia, and we analyzed what they did. And then we interviewed the experts and asked them some questions about AAC assessment and what they did during their assessments. And we took all of that data together and compiled it and came up with some AAC protocols for assessment in aphasia and the other populations. They're not available yet, but they should be soon. But I wanted to summarize for you what we found. What we found when we compiled all the data is that assessment really is broken up into three possible areas. The first is the pre-evaluation session interview. That is before you ever see the person with aphasia or go and do work with them. You're going to want to try to extract some information. That information includes what are their communication needs. We've talked about that. What are their current communication skills? Baseline modality testing. We've talked about that. What was their previous literacy skills, or is there any report of what their literacy skills are like now? Are there any reported sensory issues like hearing impairment or vision impairment present? And what kind of funding might they have if something needs to be purchased? Next, there's the screening level. In the screening level, we're really looking at while we're seeing the patient, do we notice that they're having any issues with AAC acceptance, and is that something that we need to further assess? Do we see or have we heard of any issues with cognition? So as they're working through the evaluation, are we noticing informally any issues with cognition? If so, we might need to go in and completely assess that area if we don't have the information we need. We might need to further explore their communication needs. We've done some pre-assessment information. During this assessment now, we may need to do some more in-depth communication needs assessment. We might need to look at their literacy and see how they're writing and how they're reading. We might have a good sense of that. Before we walk in, we might not need to do a really in-depth assessment, or we might need to do an in-depth assessment. We might want to get an idea of some of this patient's preference. Again, we may need to explore their sensory skills. We might need to get some idea around their symbol representation. What can they do with symbols? and what kinds of speech do they have. So these are things that we might be screening for and determining that further assessment is then needed in those areas. And we would do that during that first meeting with the patient during that assessment time. Lastly, the aphasia evaluation session will always include an assessment of language, motor access, their current communication skills, an evaluation of their support system, and then some kind of trials to determine what AAC system features do they need, what kind of vocabulary, what kinds of symbols are they going to need on a system, what kind of navigation are they going to be able to use on a system, how much portability do they need of the system, and then some system trials. In these protocols, they contain a glossary of information, references, and resources. So I just want to point that out to you. Those are going to be coming out. And so the protocols take all of those areas that we just talked about, the pre-interview, the screening, and then the evaluation session itself, and give you some very specific information about how to accomplish the assessment itself. That's it for this screencast. Thank you for attending, and goodbye.